Welcome back to the second micro lecture of the opioid module. In this session, we are going to continue our discussion of heroin as this industry interacts with prescription opioids in the U.S. We will also discuss the growth of synthetic opioids and how law enforcement officials are working to combat the import of fentanyl into our country. Let's go ahead and get started. While traditional opioid derivatives like morphine and heroin have a long-standing history in the U.S., more synthetic opioids are newer based on the technology required to produce them. For example, oxycodone was first developed by Bayer in 1917. Good old Bayer keeps popping up again and again. Oxycodone was developed as an alternative medicine option because heroin was becoming a problematic medicine. But it seems as though one is just substituting one for the other, as heroin was created in response to the high number of morphine users in Germany. So what you're seeing is a progressive effect in which opioids are problematic and that the pharmaceutical companies are simply creating a replacement drug that's as bad, if not worse, than the one that came before it. So oxycodone was created in the early 1900s, but it wasn't approved for use in the U.S. until 1995 when the FDA approved its use. Once the FDA approved these pills for use in the U.S., we saw a significant increase in the number of prescriptions being written to patients. As you might imagine, as the prescriptions are going up, so is the abuse rate in the U.S. Oxycodone and its sister drug, hydrocodone, are very popular prescription medicines. These medications are prescribed as analgesics or pain relievers. However, when the addiction starts to kick in is when things become less about pain relief and more about not going into withdrawal. Physical dependence can develop in as little as 3 to 5 days. As we said before, opioids are mainly used for analgesic purposes. Trying to alleviate that pain means releasing endorphins either naturally or through the use of narcotic opioids, essentially turning off the parts of the brain that perceive pain. That's why when you're injured, sometimes your body doesn't exactly feel it at first. Endorphins and adrenaline have been released, and the shock of the situation has turned off the pain receptors. Once that wears off, the pain will hit you head on. The same thing holds true when you consume an opioid product. Normally, products like morphine are used to treat short-term acute pain while in a hospital setting. Patients will not be sent home with morphine prescriptions, but instead will receive something like oxycodone or hydrocodone. However, as we've seen over time, chronic pain patients also receive prescriptions for oxycodone and hydrocodone. Overprescription of these medications has contributed to the opioid epidemic that we are still battling in this country. This map of the body shows us where the opioid receptors are and where the pain triggers are turned off. Endorphins are released in the brain and turn off the pain receptors. We are tricked into not feeling the pain, but the pain still exists until the injury is completely healed. Opioids in the brainstem essentially relax you and decrease your breathing. They turn off the neurons that control respiration. This is the main area of concern when it comes to overdose. When the brainstem is too decreased, our bodies basically forget to breathe. Within the spinal cord, without the endorphins being released from the brain, or without the pain receptors being turned off by the opioids, pain will travel down through the spinal cord. Once the opioid is ingested, the pain receptors in the spinal cord will be turned off as well. Peripheral neurons are connected to the spinal cord and they send messages back and forth. The spinal cord tells the peripheral nerves that there is no pain to register once the opioids have kicked in. Finally, we have made it to the intestines. One of the biggest issues with the buildup of these opioids involving the intestine is constipation. The continued use of opioids of any kind can lead to constipation in the patient. It doesn't take long for this one to happen at all. Regardless of the type of opioid that is prescribed, they all seem to have the same effect on the major pain receptors of the body. The goal of pain relievers is to make the body feel better and not experience the pain. But when there is no pain to combat, the medications will simply make the user feel the euphoria. Since the release of oxycodone and hydrocodone in the 1990s, we have seen millions of people become reliant on these pain medications for a variety of conditions, in addition to those who wish to use these medications recreationally. When the medications were released in the 1990s, the pharmaceutical companies promised that opioid pain relievers were a safe, effective way to treat pain without the risk of addiction or dependence. However, as we know now, that was simply not true. Advertisements like the one shown on this screen promise near instant relief without the restrictions of having to get doctor prescriptions every time the patient was out of the medication. As a controlled substance now, we see patients only being prescribed roughly 30 days of pills at one time with no refills available. However, in the early 1990s, this was not the case. 6 months of pills were available in each refill. If you are able to send the prescription off for 6 months at a time, that's a lot of narcotics that are being available to a single individual. The overprescription boom began in the early 1990s, but has continued on into the mid-2010s, and even today we recognize that overprescription continues. Researchers estimate that although the U.S. only comprises 5% of the world's population, we consume more than 80% of the world's prescription opioids. The overprescription crisis comes from pharmaceutical companies highlighting the effectiveness of their narcotic pain relievers and doctors who were willing to provide strong prescriptions with subsequent refills for patients who didn't necessarily need them. Prescription opioids were being prescribed for minor procedures where an over-the-counter pain reliever would have been enough for the patient. This chart represents the frequency of opioid use in the U.S. from 1992 through September 2020. You can see that in the early 1990s, levels aren't really increasing until about 1996-1997, when we see a significant increase begin. Remember that this is also around the time when Oxycontin and hydrocodone receive FDA approval for use in the U.S. With that approval, we see rates climb and continue to climb until roughly 2010-2011, when the rates begin to steadily decline. Even with the decline, we don't see things returning to a pre-1996 level at all. Part of the reason for the 2010-2011 peak was the increase in other types of opioid use in this country. For example, we see synthetic opioids like fentanyl take off at this time. Additionally, in 2014, we see the very first lawsuits to be filed against pharmaceutical companies on behalf of the patients who became addicted to their manufactured products. We will discuss these lawsuits more in just a few minutes. While doctors do take an oath to do no harm to their patients, their willingness to overprescribe may have done more harm than good in the long run. For example, in research conducted by Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, looking at Medicare claims from 2011 to 2016, a staggering trend emerged. In this data, researchers looked at how often prescription opioids were prescribed for procedures such as coronary artery bypass, minimally invasive gallbladder removal, lumpectomies, knee surgery, minimally invasive hysterectomies, open colectomies, and prostatectomies. For patients to be included in the study, they needed to be prescribed at least one 5 milligram tablet of oxycodone, which needed to be filled by Medicare Part D. 20,000 surgeons and prescribing doctors were included in the analysis. On average, the doctors were prescribing more than 100 opioid pills in the week following the surgeries, with instructions to take 1 to 2 pills every 4 to 6 hours as needed. The total amounts exceeded every single hospital recommendation, which typically call for 0 to 10 pills to be prescribed following these procedures. Although overprescription met its peak in 2010, we still see a strong overprescribing trend by doctors in the U.S. This study's findings were significant, as it was estimated that nearly 6% of the patients who received opiates after surgery were still taking them 3 to 6 months after the procedures, having become dependent on the medications. The opioid epidemic was officially declared as such in 2017 by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The COVID-19 pandemic resulted in a setback when it came to drug overdoses related to opioid use in the U.S. Drug overdose deaths surged in the U.S. during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, increasing by 30.6% in just 12 months. The growth was widespread throughout the country, with 40 states experiencing statistically significant increases in their drug overdose death rates from 2019 to 2020. Those ranged from the smallest increase of 12.9% in Connecticut, from 34.7 deaths per 100,000 people in 2019 to 39.1 in 2020. All the way to the largest increase of 54.8% in Mississippi, going from 13.6 deaths per 100,000 people in 2009 to 21.2 in 2020. Much of the growth in drug overdose deaths was driven by synthetic opioids such as fentanyl, which increased more than 50% from 2019 to 2020. Fentanyl has become a key product for international drug traffickers, often finding its way as an adulterant in other drugs like heroin and cocaine, and even as an ingredient in counterfeit pills of common opioid prescriptions such as OxyContin. The emergence of fentanyl in the U.S. illicit drug trade is a new phenomenon beginning in the past decade, and it has recently spread from eastern states to increasingly affect states in the western half of the country as well. In May 2014, the Santa Clara County Counsel's Office, along with the Orange County District Attorney's Office, filed the nation's first government-initiated lawsuit to hold opioid manufacturers accountable for their role in creating the opioid epidemic. The Oakland City Attorney and the Los Angeles County Council joined the lawsuit in 2018. The trial began on April 19, 2021, in Orange County Superior Court with the case People of the State of California v. Purdue Pharma et al., Orange County Superior Court. It is important to note that although this was the first case of its kind, it was by no means the last, and each individual case was tried in its own jurisdiction. Additionally, there was a class action federal lawsuit filed on behalf of 2,800 American cities, towns, and counties. This was heard in the Northern District of Ohio. The federal lawsuit was settled with the plaintiffs for a total of $260 million before the trial on October 21, 2019. Johnson & Johnson was also sued in a class action lawsuit resulting in a $26 billion settlement. This lawsuit was settled in February 2022, and the first payments were scheduled to go out in April of that year. Of the $26 billion, 85% will go towards addiction, treatment, and prevention services. In return for the settlement, those parties involved in the suit agreed not to pursue any additional legal action. At the time of the settlement, it was second in value only to the Big Tobacco master settlement that we discussed earlier in the semester. Also in March 2022, a settlement was agreed upon by 9 state attorneys general and the Purdue Pharma Company, the maker of OxyContin. This settlement was worth $6 billion and was different from the previous settlements as it also named the Sackler family in the lawsuit. They are the owners of Purdue Pharma. This is an interesting one, as normally lawsuits would only target the company under the notion of corporate personhood, thus leaving individual employees and owners as exempt. The Sackler family denied any wrongdoing in the case and tried to direct the lawsuit only toward the corporation. The Sacklers were not individually charged with criminal wrongdoing, but agreed to personally pay $225 million to the DOJ as part of a different settlement in 2020. With this settlement and the one against the corporation as a whole, the Sacklers negotiated protection from future suits. The Purdue Pharma settlement would essentially bankrupt the company, and they appealed the ruling, which was affirmed in May 2023. As part of the appeals court ruling, the Sackler family would be protected, but Purdue Pharma was required to file for bankruptcy and pay the $6 billion settlement in full. Many argue these settlements aren't even a drop in the bucket in comparison to the nearly $1 trillion in costs associated with the havoc wreaked by the opioid epidemic. These are just a couple of the different settlements associated with the opioid suits. On Canvas, I have provided a website with the full listing of the different settlements today, so feel free to explore if you would like more information. One of the side effects of the lawsuit and of the crackdown of overprescription efforts of doctors is the move to straight-based opioids, when the prescriptions ran out. For those who were hooked on OxyContin and hydrocodone and who were unable to get these drugs, they sought out heroin and other synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Once the opioid epidemic was officially declared as such in 2017, you saw a crackdown on overprescribing and the shutdown of many pain clinics, which would allow prescriptions to be issued without much reasoning. This led to some very desperate people doing some very desperate things to get their medications. While you don't hear about these cases as much these days, there were many instances in which desperate users would break into Walgreens and other pharmacies to gain access to their pain meds. One story out of Tennessee occurred in May 2021 when a man hid inside the drywall of a Walgreens and then tunneled his way into the pharmacy section of the store to steal the pain meds. That's dedication to substance abuse for sure. You could see why in some instances it would be easier for folks just to go back to their dealers rather than trying to get doctors' help back and forth. One of the biggest issues in returning to street drugs is that you don't know what you're getting. As I mentioned a few slides back, drug overdose deaths rose to record levels during the COVID-19 pandemic. These deaths were massively attributed to fentanyl use in this country. In 2021, more than 70,000 people died in the U.S. due to a fentanyl-related overdose. This wasn't due just in part to straight fentanyl use. Sometimes when users purchased heroin, they were unaware that their drug was being laced with the much stronger opioid. This was about a 4 times increase than overdoses in the previous 5 years. This led to a death rate of 22 deaths per 100,000 people, as fentanyl has been proven to be 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. People aren't using the dosages, or aren't used to the dosages rather, and therefore don't know the effect that the drug will have on their bodies. So what is being done to combat the high rates of fentanyl use in the U.S.? While state and federal government agencies are working to combat the importation of fentanyl from other countries and are trying to remove it from the streets, one of the biggest tools at our disposal is the use of Naxalone, or Narcan by brand name, which is being used to immediately reverse the effects of a fentanyl overdose. It works on other opioids as well, but we see it being most commonly used on fentanyl users who are unaware of the strengths of the drug in question. Naloxone is known as an opioid antagonist, which blocks opiate receptors, stopping the spread of the drug throughout the body. Naloxone costs somewhere between $22 and $60 per dose and can be administered by first responders as either a nasal spray or as an auto-injector medication. Currently, the federal government is helping to supplement the cost of the medication to agencies so that they are not responsible for the entire cost of the medication on their own. Specific trainings are also required to administer the medication as well. In April 2023, it was announced that naloxone, or Narcan, would be available at pharmacies as an over-the-counter drug, costing roughly $50 for 2 doses of the reversal medication. By making it an over-the-counter drug, this solves the prescription issue for many patients who were unable to pay the $130 copay when it was available via prescription only. For many critics of the $50 over-the-counter price, they suggest that even this is too much money for those who might need to prioritize rent, food, and their opioid habits first. Research suggests that 6 in 10 uninsured adults with an opioid use disorder have low incomes. Of those individuals, 1/3 of them had incomes 100 to 200% below the federal poverty line. With next to no income, it is unlikely that they will be able to afford the $50 price tag for the naloxone. In addition to the reversal efforts, additional federal policies have been put in place by both the Trump and Biden administrations, as we discussed in the War on Drug lecture, meant to target both the traffickers and the suppliers. Part of the difficulties in these efforts is the difficulty in finding the original suppliers. Many of these synthetic opioids are coming to the U.S. from China via Mexico. With as many networks that are being disrupted, there are that many more successful in getting the drugs across the border. Efforts that were originally meant for things like marijuana have now taken a harder turn towards a target that we can't even find. This concludes the second micro lecture of the opioids lecture. I know I focused more on the most recent issues facing our country, and this doesn't even begin to touch on the breadth of the problem. But there are many more opioids like morphine, codeine, and others that we could have touched on. I felt as though we spent our time most wisely focusing on the newest issues facing opioid users in this country. If you are interested in learning more about addiction to opioid drugs, I encourage you to visit the CDC or other government sources to learn about the specific types of opioids and their effect on the human body. In our last module, we will focus on drug treatment and drug courts that were created as a way to help the drug user rather than to criminalize the addiction. I'll meet you back here next time for our final discussion.